Hello, I'm Aaron Boley, a Canada Research Chair in Planetary Astronomy and one of the co-directors of the Outer Space Institute. I am sitting on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and I'm grateful to be here. I have the pleasure of speaking today with three amazing individuals who are working to mitigate light pollution, working with Indigenous communities on projects concerning Indigenous astronomy, and investigating Indigenous and Western sciences. Jennifer Howse is the Rothney Astrophysical Observatory and Education Specialist, and Maureen Luchsinger and Laura Griffen are with the Anne and Sandy Cross Conservation Area. Thank you so much for being here with me. And I would like to start by asking Jennifer to say maybe a little bit more about her background, the observatory, and where you are.
Right. So the Rothney Astrophysical Observatory and the Anne and Sandy Cross Conservation Area are located under the starry skies of the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy comprising of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation, Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. It's the Foothills region of southern Alberta is also home to the Métis Nation Region 3, which I am personally a member of that of the Métis Nation. And so what I do at the observatory, I'm education specialist, and so we do a lot of public outreach, and I talk to a lot of people about astronomy, and with that I've also been very fortunate to be able to raise awareness on the issues around light pollution and light pollution mitigation.
Awesome. Thank you again for being here with us. And then Laura and Maureen, I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about the Anne and Sandy Conservation Area, because I think a lot of people have a mental picture when someone says observatory, but maybe not of the conservation area.
Okay, I'll go ahead. The Anne and Sandy Cross Conservation Area is a 4,800 acre wildlife reserve, which consists of forests and grasslands and pond ecosystems. It's located just southwest of Calgary in the Foothills County, just a stone's throw away from the Rothney. And the land was donated by Anne and Sandy Cross. And at the time in 1987, it was the largest private land donation of its kind in Canada. So it was a very significant contribution, donation to wildlife conservation of habitat for native species of wildlife. And they donated it with the intention of three guiding principles: to protect the habitat and provide space for native species of wildlife, to provide education, conservation education programs, especially for youth, but for all ages and in our area, and also to manage the human use of the land. So it was really it was a real visionary aspect of Sandy and Anne Cross to put this, to donate this land after having ranched on it for several years, and continue to provide an amazing habitat for all this wildlife, both during the day and the nocturnal world. So we've been providing education programs now since 1993, and have had over 125,000 youth come through our doors and onto our land. So it's been pretty exciting.
Laura, do you want to add to that?
I can just say that it's a very beautiful place. We have a wonderful view of the Rothney Astrophysical Observatory.
Yes, you do.
Yeah.
Look out. And it was actually Sandy originally owned both pieces of land, so he's donated to both of them. So very grateful for that donation from Anna and Sandy. But yeah, because we could show you a picture, you'd get an idea of how it looks.
Well, that's great.
And so, yeah, so you can see that nice connection that we have, that the land that the observatory was donated back in 1970 and donated by Sandy Cross. And at the time, it was by far the largest donation whether you looked at it monetarily or land mass, it was the largest donation to the University of Calgary. And so we're about a year and a half away from our 50th anniversary.
Wow. Yeah.
So how does this collaboration work between the conservation area and the observatory? And actually, maybe before we go into that question, I want to go back. Jennifer, you brought up light pollution mitigation. And I think when we say light pollution, people have some general idea, but maybe not, a full grasp of what's happening with light pollution. So maybe starting with Jennifer, and then everyone could chime in, what is meant by that and kind of what's happening.
So, yeah, I would define light pollution as just very simply, it's wasteful light that's not needed. And it's artificial light that shines up into the night sky. It's an amazing thing to think, this is just such a human thing, is that it's too much of a good thing. Over 100 years ago, you would have been able to find many, many places on the earth where you would have had very dark, very natural skies. And now, within this 100-year period, already a dark sky is actually a very precious and becoming more rare natural resource. And so light pollution is completely very easy to mitigate, and it actually saves money. So it's one of those ones where it's kind of fascinating that we continue to create too much light. We can continue to design lighting that goes up into the sky when it's completely unnecessary. We need lights on the ground. We live in a 24-hour society. Absolutely, we need lights to be able to move around in our cities, in our spaces. That's all good, but the fact that we have LEDs that are too far into the blue spectrum, so it's very harmful for us, and the fact that there's too much and it's so wasteful. And then ironically, there's parts of the earth where there's people who are in a lot more disadvantaged type circumstances where they could use just a little bit more light at night. And that's also such a typical thing, too much in some places and not quite right, and not appropriate in other places.
What are some of the consequences of this light besides, it being wasteful?
It's wasteful, and it certainly has a lot of effects on the astronomical community and our ability to observe the night skies. And very important as well, as now as this generation is growing up in this area of wherever their area the planet is, where they're getting too much light, they're losing that connection, that natural connection that they should have to the sky. There's places in say in India, for example, where there's children growing up and they've never seen a star in the sky because they've lived in this very overlit area their entire life.
What about from the conservation area? What are some of the dangers with light pollution from your point of view? And either Laura or Maureen could go ahead.
Laura, you might as well take that one. I can go. Well, first I'll just state that the conservation area has actually also become the first nocturnal preserve in Canada in 2015. And that was a designation by the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. And it was set aside a designation to protect areas set aside for biological conservation and to support the nocturnal environment for wildlife by minimizing the artificial light and the light pollution that Jennifer just described. But I think I'll pass this to Laura to talk a little bit more about the impacts that we see on the wildlife and the human aspect.
Yeah. So, I mean, and Jennifer was talking about how much energy is wasted for these lights as well. So I just kind of want to start on that because
yeah, please.
Not only are you using this energy for something that you don't necessarily need, but it's a double whammy because the light that you're producing is going to impact the trees, which I can get into a little bit more later, which are absorbing things like the greenhouse gas emissions that we are producing when we're making all of this extra energy. So we are hindering trees' ability to absorb carbon dioxide, and we're producing more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, which is not going to be good for our atmospheric conditions. But some of the health effects of light pollution on people has to do with our circadian rhythm. So we all have a circadian rhythm, which is this biological clock that tells us, what to do, when to get up. And this is controlled by melatonin. And melatonin is produced during dark periods of time, typically at night. And nocturnal animals have melatonin as well. It just controls them in a different way. So their hormones, when they get this, is telling them to wake up and let's go hunting. Yeah. Whereas if we're a diurnal animal, it's telling us, go to sleep and rest and rejuvenate your body. So if you get light shone on you during the dark period of time, it can drop your melatonin levels to almost zero in about 15 minutes. And so once the light goes away, you have to start your cycle over again to produce your melatonin. And people experience jet lags.
I think people forget, that we're animals and that we have these responses to the environment, and we've taken ourselves out of that, but we can't physiologically, completely do that.
No, we've evolved to sleep in the dark. And so, it is a very slow process to change that aspect of our lives. And people like shift workers especially are impacted by this. So they are constantly exposed to light at night. It's not just like a little light going off. They're underneath that light. And so they've actually, shift work is now considered a level 2 carcinogen, which is the same level as smoking impact on your lungs, just because they're, for multiple reasons, but they suspect that a lot of it has to do with your blue light exposure at night and your body's inability to cope with that properly. So your circadian rhythms are not going to be working properly. Your hormones aren't going to be produced properly. So particularly with breast cancer and cancers that are have to do more with your hormones, there's going to be more cases of that in shift workers, which is unfortunate. So that's health for people.
I think it's pretty amazing that it's not just the fact that we have extra light at night, but it's also the wavelengths of light that we're using that have a big impact.
And the American Medical Association has identified that blue spectrum, the light, that light pollution, the artificial light is a health hazard. To humans, they've already identified it as something that has to be addressed. It's not something just the few of us are talking about. It's being talked by the Medical Association as well.
It has a direct connection, of course, as Jennifer brought up, then with the sky as well, because that's just going to give us some of the greatest scattering and cause some of the greatest amount of actual light pollution in terms of being able to see the sky. So it's amazing how this is all connected in many different ways.
Yeah.
What are some of the ways that you're trying to mitigate light pollution and raise awareness then? So who would like to start?
Some of the things that we've been doing is through education, and Jennifer actually already mentioned the programming that we've done together, and so that has been a great opportunity to educate our youth and educate students and you and the community about it. We've just last night we completed our week-long hikes we called it the Halloween Howl hikes, and it was really to raise awareness and bring attention to the nocturnal environment as well as the impacts of light pollution. So we were running 3 to 4 hikes a night, and with up to 12 people in a cohort, and experiencing the land at night and embracing the darkness. We were telling them although we were telling them ghost stories and different things along the way, we really focused on nocturnal animals in the environment. And we're saying the only thing terrifying about this hike will be the light pollution. So as it was a great opportunity to embrace the darkness. And Jennifer was there many nights giving the astronomical view of the world and embracing the night sky as well. So it was a really nice working together, which we've done on many cases. In fact, another one was when we both presented to a school called Bandit Peak in the community just outside not far from our area. The school really embraced this community initiative and built a whole day community event for not only the school but all the surrounding neighbors to come in and learn more about light pollution and different aspects through many different means, through presentations, through sound, through plays, through really interesting and creative ways to demonstrate the importance of the dark in the world around them. So there's been a lot of education and community components to it, as well as, and so that's our main gist. There's other people that have brought up advocacy outside of our world and looking to us to do that. Maybe Laura, you can talk a little bit about the webinar that was put together for us.
For us,
or with that we put together. Sorry.
Oh,
yeah. With Gord.
With Gord.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm not quite sure where you're going with this. The Prairie Conservation Forum, we actually worked with them. We got a grant to talk about how the biological impacts are being affected by light pollution. So a lot of this has to do with distribution of animals. So if there are a number of animals that experience something called phototaxis, and you can have positive phototaxis, and that's when you're drawn to the light, and there's negative phototaxis when you're sort of scared of light and you go away from it. So the ecosystems get impacted when you introduce an artificial light at night, because you have this light here in the middle, and then you have all the positive phototaxis organisms going towards it. The negative ones are going away from it. And if you're an animal and that's your food source, so let's say you're a bat and you want some moths, and they're all hanging around this one lamppost, you're gonna have to go into there. Bats they have the ability to echolocate, so they could still find those moths. But if you're something like an amphibian and you're relying on your really well adapted eyesight, which has been evolved to see really well in the darkness, you're not going to be able to see those insects as well in that light area. And you're also going to be blinded by those lights. So you're going to be avoiding those lights. So suddenly you can't get that food source. The other thing is if you're in the light, suddenly you might be exposed to predators that you wouldn't normally be exposed to. So a lot of the bats moved into the nighttime dark environment, so they could start hunting for insects, and they wouldn't have as much competition from birds and whatnot. And then all of a sudden it's a lit environment. Now those birds can stay active longer and be eating those insects as well. And then the insects, if they're experiencing positive phototaxis, then all of a sudden they're hanging around this light all night, and they have ecological roles. They could be pollinating plants at night, acting as a food source. And so this nighttime pollination isn't happening as large of a scale as it should be. And then some of the daytime pollinators are starting to suffer because those plants aren't reproducing as well, and there's not as many of them. So it's kind of this lots of effects.
Well, it's the whole chain here. The one, so I think people can conceptualize by impacting animals and then how that can impact a bunch of other things. You mentioned trees though earlier, and that might be a harder thing to fully realize how it's going to impact trees. So could you maybe make a few more comments about that?
All right. So trees, if you're a tree, then you're relying on the seasonal cues, and the axis of the earth is tilted, so we have seasons. So that's a reliable thing, is as the day is getting shorter and the nights are getting longer, that's telling the tree that, okay, now it's time to prepare for winter. So I'm going to have to go through senescence. I'm going to have to pull back the nutrients in my leaves and put them back into the trees and in my root system, so I'm prepared for winter. So if suddenly that tree is being illuminated all the time, it's not getting that seasonal cue as well, because it's not seeing that, okay, it's winter time. It's seeing that, oh, it's still summertime, so I can have my leaves out. And then when winter does hit, because it will, then their leaves aren't prepared for it. So you might have die off from frost, or from winter, just freezing of the cells before they get a chance to recycle those nutrients. So over time, that tree's health is going to be significantly impacted. Or on the opposite side, if it's springtime, they're relying on the increasing daylight to have bud bursts happen. But if they're underneath this lamp, again, they might be like, oh, it's spring, so I can put out my leaves. And then all of a sudden we have a late frost that comes in and kills it. And then that tree is not going to have to, if it can, it's going to try and regrow those leaves later on in the season, but it's not going to be ready to go at the start of spring when it should be because of that light. So there's a few pictures. I've even taken some I can send you of trees that are being tricked, and you can see that section of the tree that's illuminated is holding on to its leaves longer, or it's putting out its leaves faster than the rest of the tree. So
I want to come back to kind of the human component. I know you're all working closely with the Indigenous communities, and so I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how light pollution, is affecting those communities in particular. Jennifer, do you want to start?
Yeah.
Okay, so sorry, I'm just going back to. All right. So we've been at the observatory, we've been very fortunate that we've gotten some funding to do some work with some Indigenous communities. I've been very grateful and happy to be able to work with some of the Indigenous elders, and we've been talking about scientific understanding of the night sky. And I see a real interesting, compelling connection between the way Indigenous science, specifically Blackfoot science, thinks in terms of land and sky connections. And so much of their scientific basis and their perspectives have to do with seeing land and sky as one and seeing it all within its context. So when you step outside of that context and you're having difficulty, your sky is obscured by light pollution, it makes it very difficult to be able to teach children about those scientific connections and to understand that context if they're living in an urban environment, for example, and you have very limited view of the sky.
Can you help us conceptualize some of these connections? Like, is there a way to really get a good idea of what it means to have that?
So I think probably a good way to think about it is that Western science is often thinks in terms of, say, like placing a grid upon nature. Mm-hmm. So an understanding of nature has to do with quantifying it, separating it of its parts, and then examining those parts. And to think about it all in context means simply that you can't think about one separate piece without thinking about all of the other pieces together. So, and that's why I'm talking about, you can't just think about the sky, you have to think about the land sky and think about apparent motion of all of the objects that pass overhead. And that, because of course, time and space is cultural. And so then when you have those perspectives of understanding how things move in the sky, it has to do with that connection to the land. And it's not something that can be easily separated when you're thinking about traditional ways of knowing.
Yeah,
go ahead, please.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, like, Indigenous ways of knowing is really demonstrates the wisdom of this interconnectedness of the relationships in nature. And it's really important to work and understand these interconnections to build a deeper relationship within the natural world and what's around us. And as Jennifer was saying, when we piecemeal items, we miss the bigger picture of what's involved, including the land-sky connection, which she was describing. I mean, we can even look at our migratory birds to understand how important it is for the connections with the land sky when they're migrating using celestial navigation, and the light pollution is impacting their way, so to speak. And so it's causing them to take longer, use up more energy, and have a lot of difficulty in moving around into their desired habitats where they need to return to and come from. So it's already showing we have to look at the whole and not look at the parts to understand that connection.
Do you think that's one of the biggest? Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
You were going to follow up. was
No,
going to ask you.
I was just going to follow up with one comment and then
Yeah,
sorry
please.
about that. So I said, and this is why I think astronomy's theme, and it fits very well with exploring Indigenous science for those reasons, because astronomy is so predictable. I guarantee you, every time the moon is going to night at 6:35 p.m. I can guarantee it. And so there's that wonderful patterns and predictability that we can rely on. And then that also what makes astronomy the oldest science of relying on that more so than any other place, any other piece of the natural world. Astronomy is certainly the most predictable and things that you can expect. But it's also really a great opportunity to talk related elements and the natural flow and how the natural rhythms are created.
Oh, Jennifer, I'm so sorry, but you started to break up that last point, and I believe that was very important. So I'm just hoping you could repeat that last bit for us.
So I think that astronomy is, per example, of the integrated elements, including the natural ebbs and flows of things in the sky. So you have all of their, so that you have standing sky, whether it's planets in the sky, regular relations are certainly that we see. We can rely on our southern sky, for example, to show us a seasonal change.
Yeah.
And so all of that predictability, and it works very well with the interrelationships to be able to understand that land and sky.
I have another part to add. I just thought of this. The other thing with the Indigenous communities as well is that if you're living off land and using the land as resources and food sources, when you have the loss of biodiversity that light pollution can cause, and particularly in waterways, because fishing is an important food source, and there's certain fish that won't go into the light or can't cross these light barriers as they come up. So that food source is now being limited for you, and it's going to slowly decrease over time and affect your ability to get food. And they've had studies on salmon as well, and that they're more likely to be predated. Zooplankton doesn't rise to the surface as much. So that means that algae isn't being eaten as well, which causes algae blooms, which again affects the ability of the fish to live in certain areas and certain lakes if that natural process isn't helping. So I would say it also impacts their ability to get food. So.
One of the themes that I've heard now from this discussion is that you have Indigenous science, which is looking at a lot of connectivity, and then I'm wondering, with Western science, which kind of going to your grid analogy, which kind of imposes this grid for knowing and compartmentalizes things and so forth, what is maybe one of the biggest takeaways Western science can have from or let me say it differently, what do you think is one of the best things that Western science could learn from Indigenous science?
I think that it's time to hear some more diverse voices. Mm-hmm. In the practice of science. There's many different perspectives out there that lead us to greater understandings, mm-hmm. greater ways of being able to collect data and take our observations. It is interesting in the respect that I sometimes feel this pushback. And this idea of like, this is the way it was in 18th century Enlightenment. This is the way we started out. This is our scientific method. Let's hang on to that. And I think that's all wonderful. It's process. I mean, look at the world, this incredible world we've been able to build because of that. That shouldn't mean, and that's what we're learning now. It shouldn't mean that we need to exclude other voices in our observations and our understandings. And I think that so many, like say, for example, reserves in Canada even people who live in rural areas, like I said, we would like them to learn a little bit more about the fact that even though they may at the moment have nice dark skies, this is actually becoming imperiled.
Yeah.
That there is a lot more development, there's a lot more satellites being launched, there's light pollution is now a global threat and not merely an urban threat. And so one of the things that we're certainly looking at in ways that we can reach out to people who do live in rural areas, reach out to Indigenous peoples who are on reserve systems, and perhaps get them engaged in some of our research when they're looking up at their own skies, take measurements, have an understanding about what a dark sky looks like. And our long-term goal is that hopefully that they can understand that what we're trying to do is protect that wilderness of the dark sky. And that is, as Ed mentioned before, a precious resource that we should be really thinking about.
Have you had a really good response with that?
Yes, I'm actually, to be perfectly honest with you, yes, we have. People have a good understanding about it. I would say the only time we get sign of pushback is people worry about security. And that's fair. That's a fair comment. And so I think though, when I explain to them, it's about smart lighting. There's so many smart ways that we can do this and we can approach some of these challenges, like pollution challenges. It's not about taking light away. It's about not shining the light in the sky and not being wasteful with the light that we have. There's smart ways that we can do it, and also have dark sky areas, parks. How many times have you gone to a campground, for example, and they've got some post with this big shining light that shines 24 hours? I'm absolutely like, why? And so we just try and get people, just have a think about what you're doing. Do you really need to have a light on outside of your back door 24 hours a day? Probably not. All you're doing is telling the bad guy where your back door is. You're not actually solving a security problem. So there's a lot, it's about smart lighting. It's not about not lighting. And so when people understand that, then I find that there's a very positive response that yes, we can do better and we can do more.
Yeah. And
Maureen,
and
I think we're going to say, go ahead, Laura.
No, I think Maureen was cutting in.
Okay. And I was just going to say that we've worked with Indigenous elders and learning leaders and in the Indigenous world, and we found that there's a strong connection in the Western world around ecology. And ecology is the study of the natural environment and of all the relationships of organisms to each other and to their surroundings. So I think slowly we're learning about moving into trying to work through the community that is the land sky, that we are the land is a community, the land sky is a community, and the community is the land sky, so that we are recognizing those interrelationships. So I think that's where, as you were asking before, where more Western sciences is trying to evolve. I mean, we've had different ecologists and biologists stating those concepts and pursuing that kind of evidence of that kind of connections to those entities. So we're trying.
Yeah. But in addition to the communities, have you had any strong connections with any of the policymakers on city council or anything who've been receptive to these ideas?
We've been working very hard. There's been a few large developments that have happened close to the observatory, for example. And Dr. Phil Langell is the director of the observatory, and he's working hard, making all of those connections. There's 3 layers of government. We've got a counselor that we work with in the Foothills County, Suzanne Oil, and she's been very supportive of our initiatives. As a matter of fact, yearly we have an event where we invite our neighbors that live in the community. We talk about our research at the observatory and just how important dark skies are to our research, but also how important dark skies are for them in their quality of life. And our neighbors are actually very responsive to it. We are hoping to avoid a situation that they had at the Richmond Hill observatory, the Dunlap Observatory, where eventually you had so much residential move in that unfortunately, essentially it blinded the telescope. And so we're trying our very best, knowing that there's so much development ongoing all the time. Sometimes it feels a lot like we're holding back the tide, but we talk to people, and I think it resonates with the fact when people understand it's for their personal benefit to think about some of these issues.
Yeah, and you find also a lot of time when you go and you talk to these people, or if you go to the development meetings, or you, I know when I went to the provincial representative in my area, they're like, "Oh, I've never heard of light pollution. What do you mean by that?" So there's still this like very like it's not a thing because you shut off a light and all of a sudden it's not there. So there's still a lot of just unawareness of the general population that this is a thing that is out there happening. So
I remember,
That's a good point to bring up very quickly, and that is, it is a renewable resource.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so there are many things that we in our societies have messed up, and it's going to take a long time to fix. But this is something that can be fixed with the right policy and initiatives and education.
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny. We had a student in one of our classes that her father was a city planner, and after we had a week-long study with them, and she put together a PowerPoint presentation to present to her dad to explain the impacts of light pollution on them. So fingers crossed, that might have made a difference. So you just don't know where you're going to get the impetus and that understanding of, oh, this is important and this is valuable, and she valued it. So we'll see. So it's always good. Education is key.
I mean, it's great that you're getting such positive reception from this, and you're doing this great work, kind of leading this charge with trying to understand, or with education and trying to let people know about what they will be missing or are missing. There are many people who will be listening who may be wondering, where could they possibly start? They might not have individuals such as you. So since we're on this topic at the moment, I'm hoping you might be able to give them some encouragement or let them know kind of what are the first steps.
The International Dark Sky Association has a wonderful website, a lot of resources, and it really, they spend a lot of time defining what is light pollution and what are its implications. And then if you're inspired to take that information elsewhere, then you can, they've got a lot of tools to be able to take to educate other people, like you said, maybe take it into a city council, or maybe take it to a classroom where you can talk about really what's involved with light pollution, and more importantly, mitigation, what actually you can do, and what people can actually start doing right away.
And I find too, on a smaller scale with your family, just explaining how important it is for them to use the warm light settings on their computers, because nowadays a lot of computers have this thing, so they'll shut off the blue light, and to explain the science behind that and why that's beneficial to their health. I know that's how I converted my brother, because he just had this like blue light shining in his room all the time while he was sleeping on his like air purifier. And I was like, oh, you should just, if you cover that light, you'll sleep better, because he was having terrible sleep. It's like, so just small little things to get it in their heads and thinking about it is helpful. And then like the bug lights, a lot of the stuff is like people don't want to be distracted by insects on their porch when they're outside at night trying to enjoy themselves. And so just like, if you use a bug light, all of a sudden the temperature's right, those bugs aren't going to be around. And well, yeah, by the way, there's all those benefits that's happening in the background with the ecological community, because you're not bringing all those bugs to one spot. So subtly trying to get them to improve their own lives, and then like sneaking in the education.
Yes.
Well done.
Yeah, that's a great point. I want to come back to one of the things that was brought up earlier with this connection with the land and sky, and I'm wondering if the Blackfoot in particular had a model for things like the solar system and so forth, and how we would conceptualize that in Western society, or is that not a way of thinking about it? I mean, like such as like having some type of visualization of like distinction of planets, planetary orbits, and things like that.
I think probably what I love is when I think about finding your place.
Mhm.
And there's a traditional Blackfoot way that talks about 7 directions. So you can think about your 4 cardinal points, your north, south, east, and west. But then you can also think about above you, below you, and where you are. And I think that's so perfect when you think about the fact that we live on a spinning ball moving through space. What a perfect way to center yourself in all of that motion to be able to understand what's happening above you in the sky. And that's what I was getting at about being contextual and being understanding where you are in this whole system. And that's one of the things that I really love. And it certainly made me have pause and think about, like I was saying, about hearing different perspectives on finding out where we are, that there is different ways that we can do that. That about one being more accurate than the other, it's just a different way of looking at it. And in the same way that apparent motion really is, it's also a personal perspective.
Yeah. Well, I like this point that you've emphasized now several times here as well, that you know, where you are is an important point in understanding the direction.
Yes.
I
Yeah,
think
and placing yourself within that context. Yes.
Yeah. And that's very much an Indigenous ways of knowing, is being extremely present and being in the moment, in the land, and why they put so much emphasis on the seasons. And they don't tell stories that are in different seasons because it's not relevant in this moment, and being present and mindful and understanding that what's around you is what's happening right now, and to use all your senses to make these connections and to spend that time to engage in that space in that moment. And it's been part of our learning as we've been working with the different Indigenous leaders, and it's really been impactful and very, very, very accepted, especially by youth and others around that, because they probably understand it the best, as is their nature, their innate capacity to really connect with the natural world and be present in those moments.
In some ways, I suppose, I feel like certainly with the various training I've had as a scientist, that I'm like removing myself from that. Like I want to kind of take it out, and I'm some external observer, and I don't necessarily have a place in the system. And so this seems very different from that.
Right.
Entirely.
And so you can see where there can be some pushback, or there's a reluctance to think in those terms, and I get it.
Yeah. There's definitely a push-pull, but we often talk to students that nature's all around us. It's not out there, it's us, and we are nature. We are part of the ecosystem of the world around us, and we figuring those places with us is really important for our understanding, and for us to care about what we care about. And if we care about something, we'll take care of it, and we'll steward and sustain it for, as Indigenous communities say, they look 7 generations into the future just for sustainability. And we need to put that hat on and start thinking in those terms so that we can see 7 generations from us.
Yeah. But that's a wonderful segue for another question. And that is, we don't have to look 7 generations into the future. But right now, there are 60 satellites going up every about 2 weeks, setting up one of these so-called mega constellations, in which we're going to have about 12,000 satellites from just one communication network, and that would be Starlink. But we just found out that China has, a company in China has went ahead and filed for an additional 12,000, a new constellation that would have an additional 12,000 satellites. There's OneWeb, there's the Kepler mega constellation. And right now we have about 6,000 satellites in orbit, only half of which are actually working. And so this is going to be a tremendous change in the number of satellites that anyone can see. And so I'd like to switch toward thinking about how this could impact our view of the night sky and what it would mean for particularly Indigenous communities, but then also society as a whole.
So the filling of near-Earth space with satellite is really unfortunate for astronomers, and it's such a huge challenge. There was a few weeks ago, the United Nations had a conference discussing this very topic.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very, very hard to hear about all of this rapid release of these thousands of satellites. And there's very little mitigation possible to be able to deal with this looming problem that it's going to be. It's, and it's so easy. I think it would be very easy for people to shrug it off and say, oh, it's just an astronomy problem, and that, it's going to hinder optical and radio observations. But it's much more than that. This is near-Earth space, and it's being filled with something that's, it just seems as if there's all of this potential waste, all of this potential space junk out there, and there doesn't seem to be a big plan of how we're going to deal with all of that waste. Feels very much like plastic in the ocean, yeah. And now we're going to have junk metal in the sky is what I'm seeing within even sooner than 7 generations, unfortunately. And so, it's, yes, Indigenous communities, in the same way as a lot of rural communities, would really benefit from access to the internet. That's a wonderful idea. I'm just wondering if it seems as if we're using some very antiquated technology. If it takes 1,000 satellites to do this, I wonder if time and working with more scientists would have been able to come up with some better solutions. But it seems like it's a big race right now. Who can put more satellites in? I think I heard that some of these satellite releases have about a 3% rate of satellites that aren't even communicating. So then even at the point of release, they're already space junk. And it's a terrible impending thing, but it just seems so wasteful. And it seems like it's in too much of a rush. And it also, without a doubt, it's happening without any sort of smart global oversight.
Yeah. And
go ahead, please.
I was just going to agree with Jennifer. It seems very money driven right now, with companies trying to get like, oh, this is going to be our little gold star. Put a terrible pun out there. But also, like, from an ecological perspective, I don't know if there's a lot of studies that have been on the impacts of satellites other than like there's space junk up there. But is this going to affect the celestial navigation if there's all of a sudden all these little dots moving around for the birds? Even dung beetles use celestial navigation. So it's one of those things where it's kind of like with the light bulb. We discovered we could make a light bulb, and then like humans just went overboard with it. So like, oh yeah, we can use satellites for this, and now all of a sudden there's all these satellites up there, and we're not really studying like this is how it's benefiting us, but is there adverse consequences for other things that live on this planet? Like, we're not the only animals here. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning that people like to remove themselves a little bit from the animal kingdom, but we're mammals. We function on very basic level as everyone else. We have our 4 needs. They have to be met. Our habitat has to be maintained. So are these satellites long-term going to have consequences on not only our habitat, but everyone else's habitat down here on the planet? So
yeah, absolutely. It's one of the things that was being brought up here too, is the connections between different elements of an environment and nature and so forth. And I feel like when it comes to space, we treat that as something that's outside the environment. It's not an environment, and we don't have a connection with it. But one of the things that we've been talking about is actually how we do have a deep connection with space in many different ways. And I suspect that one of the reasons why there isn't necessarily a lot of pushback is because there's already some disconnection because of light pollution in the first place. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that. So people don't realize necessarily what they might end up missing or what might be polluted because it's already polluted.
I mean, I think Jennifer mentioned it already.
Okay.
With so many people who can't see the night sky.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if you've heard that story when Las Vegas or Los Angeles had a blackout. And the 911 was inundated with phone calls of people being like, "Oh, there's a whitish thing up in the sky. Is that what caused the earthquake?" Because the power grid was out. It's like, no, that's the Milky Way that you've been missing your entire life. That's fine. That's just stars. Don't worry about it. So, but that's how. So yeah, the disconnect is definitely there and present.
Is there anything that that you've been able to move forward with awareness on the satellites in terms of mitigation, or is that someplace you're looking toward in the future as part of the programming and the education and outreach?
We are hoping to start a project starting in the spring of 2021, and our programming for schools will be based on near-Earth space and near-Earth space technologies. Yeah. So even if we get to educate a generation who's going to be responsible for gathering up all that space junk, I'll be happy to be a part of that. And so one is raising awareness about that's where the future is. The chance of me getting a job doing work in near-Earth space was slim to none when I was a kid, but now the kids going in school, in elementary school, they're going to be doing jobs that we can't imagine. And some of those jobs are definitely going to be working in near-Earth space. And so I want kids hopefully to have a think about that and start understanding what that means. And just as you said, that our part of the solar system is really a part of our entire ecosystem. It doesn't stop with even with the edge of our atmosphere. It goes beyond that, and what that all means, and how we can act ethically and with stewardship of that space. And so to go back in time, I can never help it. I always have to give a little bit of a historical context. With all of the shipwrecks that were happening in the 18th century, it was definitely time that there had to be some sort of very sincere hard work on understanding the longitudinal problem and navigating at sea. Yeah. Right. However, that had been a problem for hundreds of years. So it was like, why then? And the reason why then is because then we had more global access to information. There was newspapers being printed. So when there would be a tragedy at sea, you could find out about it in Great Britain, but you could also hear about it in Spain. And so there was this communication network. So people were understanding more about the fact that these things were issues. And so then what came of that was a global law of the sea, yeah, as well as solving the longitudinal problem. So we're definitely at a time and place where we need to look at these things globally and have a global set of standards so that we can all, every point of the globe is acting ethically towards any sort of space exploration or populating space with satellites.
We are running out of time here. This has been an absolute wonderful conversation. I'd like to go around very quickly and just give everyone a chance for some ending remarks.
So I just want to say,
go ahead.
Okay. So I just wanted to say, thanks so much, Aaron. I really appreciated the chance. Obviously, you can see that the three of us are very passionate about this topic. And if nothing else, I really hope people have a think about it and how we can do things better. That's really what it's all about. There's always ways to do things smarter and better for the global community, as well as all the animals, plants, birds, and insects too.
Laura.
I would, to echo that, thank you again. Biodiversity is so important in an ecological sense, and just be very cautious of whatever we're doing to make sure that we are protecting our space and our biodiversity so we can continue to live and thrive on this planet like we have been doing. So just proceed with caution. Got off your lights.
Maureen.
Thanks also for the opportunity. And I would just echo both Jennifer and Laura on this, but I think a really positive step is to, and maybe we're getting this opportunity right now, is to go outside, be in nature, be in the environment, get to know what you won't care for what you don't love or understand. And I think the more connections we can make, the stronger we can see the impact. And they'll say, oh, well, now light pollution is stopping me from doing this. But if you don't know it, you don't live it and experience it, it's really hard to just be a talking head sometimes, as we are right now, and to help people understand that all our programming is done in the environment, and we all three of us embrace it to help give the structure and the underpinning to the knowledge that we're trying to share, because you're not just hearing it, you're seeing it, you're smelling it, you're feeling it, and you're embodying it. And I think that's so important.
Thank you once again, and thanks to everybody for watching this and for your interest in it. We will be posting some links for you to follow if you would like to learn more about light pollution and some of the things that you can do. Thank you again.